This is 3 different shorter excerpts from Hegel. I'm slowly approaching him, and I think it'd be good maybe to start here to get a kind of gentle introduction to his philosophy. So the 3 pieces in question are Dialectics, 1812, it's an excerpt. Reason Governs the World, another excerpt, and the Magistrates should be elected by the people, which is a part of an essay that was not completed. Anyways, these are my notes, so I'm going to introduce the text like right here. Dialectics is Hegel's basic conception of contradiction, where finite determinations become unstable because their own one-sidedness and limitations push them beyond themselves. Dialectic therefore produces development rather than merely destroying certainty. And a side note, according to revised metaphysical Hegelians, though, you mean on like the internet or whatever, if you believe this, you don't actually understand Hegel for some reason, and there's in fact no contradiction or negation in Hegel. They like to say logical instead of dialectical, I guess. So this entire excerpt of him talking about, dialectics and negation and contradiction, I guess he never wrote it, and anyways. Dialectic is the way finite things actually exist and develop. That being a finite determination contains limitations within itself, and those limitations drive it beyond itself towards its opposite. And so the dialectical moment is the point where definite concepts supersede themselves and transition into their opposites. Notably, contradiction is not something an external critic arbitrarily imposes upon a thing, or something external to the thing that quote-unquote nullifies it. So for example, fire does not dialectically negate water, they're just two things. Contradiction has to arise from the one-sidedness or limitation that eventually undermines a thing's claim to independence. So, I mean, this isn't really probably a good example, but just as a thought experiment, think like water evaporating, like the limitations of the water, give the conditions for it to evaporate. I don't actually think this means water's dialectical though, but just a way to think of it anyways. This is precisely why the dialectic is the real nature of cognition, the living soul of scientific progress. Genuine thinking comes from looking at how a determination depends upon limits and passes beyond itself and makes visible the imminent march forth of finite determinations. So for an example of this, we generally treat death as something externally imposed upon a living thing. But in actuality, life as such carries within it the germ of death. So the finite is therefore radically self-contradictory in that its own finitude means that it cannot simply remain what it is. Sophistry takes one isolated principle and treats it as though it were absolute. It is true that human beings have a right to secure the means of their existence, but does not follow that I may simply steal because well-being is one legitimate human concern. Hey, tell that someone needs to get this to thought slime. Anyways, in this case, the argument relies upon the isolation of one valid determination from the larger context in which it has its meaning. So dialectic is distinct from skepticism because skepticism stops at negation. I wonder how this is. I know these are my notes, but I'm summarizing this. I wonder how Adorno feels about this, because it's like that's all that. According to Hegel, I feel like he would just view Adorno as a skeptic. He wouldn't view him as a dialectician. Anyways, the skeptic establishes the nullity of everything finite, but dialectic goes further, and its negative result is actually a positive, for it contains within itself the process of its coming into being. Negation is productive. When a determination is shown to be inadequate, this does not simply leave us with nothing. The inadequacy itself points towards a more comprehensive determination. And so dialectic is therefore something which occurs throughout reality. Quote, everything that surrounds us may be interpreted as the dialectic in motion. That's kind of interesting because I felt like I feel like Zizek in his first lecture on Hegel, I have a remaster of it on my channel. He actually kind of says that's wrong, but this is Hegel saying that pretty explicitly. Anyways, natural processes, political institutions, morality, law, emotions, historical development, these are all examples from the text I'm about to read. These all display the same general principle. A finite form contains a tendency to move beyond itself. That's the dialectic as explained by Hegel in short. Now I will read the text. Dialectics by George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. This is from the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences in Outline. The dialectical moment is when definite concepts supersede themselves and transition into their opposites. But especially in philosophy, if the dialectical principle is applied outside of the context of complete understanding, it becomes skepticism, and the result is mere negation. It's not uncommon to treat dialectics as mere artifice through which, by playing up the appearance of contradictions, confusion is generated. However, though the juxtaposition can be treated as an illusion, it is in fact real. The dialectic often presents as nothing more than a subjectivistic back and forth, a method of swinging between arguments for and against, with superficial ingenuity, providing core for little substance. However, in its true and proper character, the dialectic is the real nature of cognition, the delineation of finite boundaries within a universal continuity. When we reflect upon a thing, we move beyond merely accepting its isolated existence. We give it context by bringing out its relativity, while at the same time retaining its validity in isolation. Dialectics, then, refers to the imminent march forth, such as the one-sidedness and limitations of existing determinations of positive understanding come to be understood also as negations. Anything that is finite is at the same time superseding itself. The dialectical principle thus constitutes the living soul of scientific progress. It's the only dynamic which provides immanent coherence and necessity to the discoveries of science as resulting from an inner movement rather than an external intervention from beyond what is finite. Properly understanding and recognizing the dialectic is of utmost importance. It is the principle of all movement, of all life, and all activity in the actual world. The dialectic is also the soul of all truly scientific knowledge. It is ordinarily considered fair to refrain from subjecting anyone to the rigors of abstract intellectual reason. As the saying goes, live and let live. One way is valid, but so is any other. When we look more closely, however, the impositions of any finite thing aren't merely external. Their own natural nature is the cause of their negation, transforming them into their opposite. For example, we say that man is mortal and regard dying as something resulting from external circumstances. If this understanding were correct, man would be in possession of two special properties, vitality and mortality. The true view of the matter, however, is that life as such carries within it the germ of death. The finite in general, being radically self-contradictory, entails its own negation. On the other hand, dialectics is not to be confused with mere sophistry, the essence of which consists precisely in privileging a one-sided and abstract principle in isolation, as may suit the interest and particular situation of the individual at the same time. For example, my actions should be guided by the procurement of the means for my existence. However, if I then single out this aspect, the principle of my well-being, and deduce from its consequences that I may steal or that I may betray my fatherland, I am engaging in sophistry. Similarly, it is essential for the subjective dimension of freedom that I have insight into my actions and the conviction that they are right. However, if I reason on this principle alone, then I slip into sophistry and throw all principles of morality overboard. Dialectics is essentially different from these kinds of reasoning, for it aims precisely at considering things in their contextual being and movement, thereby making apparent the finiteness of one-sided determinations of understanding. Incidentally, dialectics is nothing new in philosophy. Among the ancients, Plato is credited as the inventor of dialectics, and rightly so, insofar as it's Plato's philosophy that dialectics first appears in a free, scientific, and thus objective form. In his predecessor Socrates, the dialectic retained a predominantly subjective character. In accordance with the general character of his philosophizing, it presented as irony. Socrates directed his dialectic firstly against ordinary consciousness in general, and then against the sophist in particular. In his conversations, he used to give the impression that he wanted to find out more about the matter under discussion. Under this pretense, he asked all kinds of leading questions, drawing those with whom he conversed into believing the opposite of what they initially had set out to defend. For example, when sophists claimed to be teachers, Socrates, through a series of questions, got the sophist Protagoras to admit that all learning was mere recollection. Plato's dialogues are more strictly scientific. He uses the dialectical method to demonstrate that all fixed intellectual determinations are finite. In Parmenides, for example, the one is derived from the many, only to then demonstrate that the many is only able to constitute itself as the one. In this grand style did Plato treat the dialectic. In modern times, it was Kant, more than any other, who brought the dialectic back to the forefront and restored its pride of place. As we've seen, he did this by working out these so-called antinomies of reason. Far from presenting as conflicts deriving from a variation of grounds in the perspective, they are rather a demonstration that every abstract proposition of understanding, taken as a given absolute, turns directly into its opposite. However much the dialectic may be difficult to grasp, we must by no means imagine that it exists only as a tool for the philosopher. On the contrary, the dialectic gives expression to what is already found in all degrees of consciousness and in general experience. Everything that surrounds us may be interpreted as the dialectic in motion. We know that everything finite, instead of being fixed and ultimate, is rather changeable and transient. This is nothing other than the dialectic of the finite. The same being other than what it is, turns into its opposite. Earlier, we identified that the idea of the goodness of God was implicit in our ability to understand. We may be analogously remarks on the dialectic that, in the same objective sense, it corresponds to the idea of the power of God when we say that all things, everything that we can identify, stands on trial. We express an understanding that the dialectic is a general, irresistible power before which nothing, however secure and firm it may be first appear, stands aloof. This category does not exhaust the divine essence of the concept of God, but it does form an essential movement of all religious consciousness. Apart from this general objectivity of dialectic, we find traces of its presence in the domains and phases of the natural and spiritual world. For example, take the motion of celestial bodies. At this movement, the planet stands in one spot, but it brings into being the possibility of being otherwise by moving. Similarly, the physical elements prove to be dialectical, and meteorology offers proof of their dialectics. The principle is the same. That which forms the basis of all natural processes is that through which they're simultaneously driven beyond themselves. To illustrate the presence of the dialectic in the spiritual world, and even more specifically in the fields of law and morality, it suffices to notice that the principle that in extreme turns into its opposite is recognized in many popular sayings. For example, in law, summa ius summa injura. Abstract law, taken to its extreme, turns into justice. In politics, quote, the extremes of anarchy and despotism lead to one another. In individual ethics, pride comes before a fall. Too much wit to outwit ourselves, even feeling, bodily as well as mental, has its dialectic. As is well known, the extremes of pain and pleasure pass into each other. The overjoyed heart seeks relief in tears, and most heartache, heartfelt melancholy, will at times betray its presence by a smile. Skepticism should not be regarded merely as a doctrine of doubt. It would be more correct to say that the skeptic is absolutely certain of his point, the nullity of everything finite. He who doubts still clings to the possibility that his doubt may be resolved, that one of the certainties among which he wavers will turn out to be solid and true. True skepticism is altogether different. It completely abandons any hopes of achieving solidity and understanding, which results in an attitude of imperturbability and self-reliance. This is the case of least of the noble skepticism of antiquity, especially as conceptualized by Sextus Empiricus, who systematized and complemented the dogma of his Stoic and Epicurean predecessors in late Roman times. This lofty ancient skepticism should not be confused with the modern skepticism earlier discussed, which partially preceded critical philosophy and partly emerged just from it. This latter skepticism consists solely in denying the possibility of truth beyond mere sensation, insisting that only within our immediate sense perception is valid. Even today, skepticism is regarded as the implacable enemy of all positive knowledge in general, and thus of philosophy, insofar as philosophy is concerned with positive knowledge. But in this belief, there is a misconception. It is in fact only the limited thought of abstract intellectualism that has to fear of skepticism. Because it is unable to withstand it, philosophy, meanwhile, entertains the dialectic as a moment within itself, the dialectical moment. However, philosophy goes beyond mere skepticism, unsatisfied with its purely negative result. The skeptic is lulled into error by mere and abstract negation. In contradistinction, the negative result of the dialectic is a positive, for it contains within itself the process of its coming into being. Thus conceived, the dialectic moment sets the stage for the characterization of the third grades of logical truth, speculative form, the form of positive reason. Reason governs the world. This flows nicely from the last piece. History appears to be driven primarily by particular human interest. Quote, the actions of men proceed from their needs, passions, interest, character, and talents. So people do not generally make history because they consciously intend to realize reason. Rather, they pursue wealth, power, glory, etc. Hegel doesn't use this phrase, but on Wikipedia, this is called the cunning of reason, albeit this is a machine translation, so maybe it's lost there. Anyways, nothing great in this world has ever been accomplished without passion. However, if individuals act from particular interest, how can history have a universal rational development? Interesting side note, by the way, is that if you talk to like a Christian kind of person, they'll say that passion's evil. And this is Hegel, who sometimes people accuse of being, religious, like a religious Christian guy, or not accused, but say, and they think it's based, like Antonio Wolff, they think Hegel's a religious thinker. Here's Hegel directly contradicting Christianity, because in Christianity, passion is bad, but here's Hegel saying passion's good. Maybe some Christians don't say that, but certainly not a traditional one. Anyways, the answer to this is that particular human interests become the means through which universal historical development takes place. There are two moments. One is the idea, and the other is the tangle of human passions. The universal development of spirit, ultimately, is the development of freedom. Human passion supplies the concrete energy through which that development actually occurs. And by the way, spirit is not like a magical substance. He's kind of saying spirit, he kind of does mean it as like a concept, I think. I might actually be wrong on this, but it's like spirit, it's like so when Marxists talk about like communism, I think spirit is closer to kind of that. I'm not explaining it well though. I don't really know 100% for sure on this one. It's just he doesn't literally mean there's a ghost. Anyways, human passion supplies the concrete energy through which that development actually occurs. History is simply the result of morally virtuous people consciously pursuing the good. Virtuous intentions are insufficient to explain historical development. People pursuing their own particular objectives can unintentionally produce consequences that exceed their intentions. And think of it like this. The universal is implicit in the particular and realized through it. Okay, so they're not divided for Hegel, but you know that already. Quote, we regard the course taken by spirit as what is necessary, while also ascribing to freedom what appears to be the conscious will of men as their interest. Now, what does that mean? The activity through which a historical actor pursues a goal can transform the political and social world in ways they did not intend. This is the cunning of reason. The individual therefore participates in something larger than their conscious purpose, and that's why I think spirit is. From the standpoint of the individual, they freely pursue their interest, but from the standpoint of the world, history, those activities can become moments in a larger necessary development. Another quote, the private interests of its citizens are aligned with those of the state when each finds its satisfaction and realization in the other. So, the good state is not one that crushes individual interest in the name of the universal, nor is it one in which everyone simply pursues private interest without regard to anything universal. The successful political order is one in which particular universal interests are mediated so that individuals can recognize their own freedom within the universal intuitions. Spirit becomes conscious of itself through historical activity. The universal purpose is unconscious, and human beings pursue their particular aims without knowing that their action contributes to a broader historical development. World history gradually turns this unconscious impulse towards freedom into conscious freedom, and reason governs the world does not actually mean that every event is rational. I know as I was talking to a Hegelian, they were explicitly arguing that Hegel thinks everything is logical and rational. And it's like, then there's no dialectic. Well, also they said there is no dialectic, so I don't know what the hell they're on about. Morally good or consciously planned by reason, but that historical reason operates through the apparently chaotic activity of particular human beings. The universal does not exist outside society, it realizes itself through particular human activity. Anyways, now I will get into the text proper. Reason Governs the World by George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. The following is a new original translation of a small excerpt of Hegel's introduction to the lectures on the philosophy of history. It was crafted with the explicit goal of demystifying Hegel, of putting to rest the myth that he's unreadable and impossibly difficult to understand. My translation choices owe more to me wanting to convey my particular interpretation of his philosophical ideas than to an understanding of German. I mostly worked off of machine translation. Any suggested improvements are very welcome. Seine verifying accepts against the original German or against other official translations is strongly recommended. This is just a translation by Roderick Day, like the other two. I'm just doing them all together here. Anyways, into the text proper. If we consider how freedom comes into being, this is nothing other than the phenomenon of history. Although freedom as such is primarily an abstraction, the means by which it comes into being are concrete and present themselves before our eyes in the form of history. One single glance at history will convince us that the actions of men proceed from their needs, their passions, their interests, their characters, and their talents. This is how we develop the impression that it is only our varied needs, passions, and interests which drive the actions that we witness. Although it is true that individuals aspire to universal virtues, benevolence, or noble patriotism can play a historical role. They stand insignificant when compared to the world at large. We may well see the actualization of reason deliberately realized by these virtuous individuals in their areas of influence, but they are small in numbers in proportion to the masses of the human race. Accordingly, the extent of influence that reason has through their virtues is relatively limited. On the other hand, the passions, the pursuit of private interest, and the satisfaction of selfish desires shape reality with violent effectiveness. Their power lies in the fact that they respect none of these barriers which law and morality want to set for them, and therefore, these natural forces have more direct influence over man than the artificial and tedious discipline that tends to order and to restraint, to law and morality. When we see this carnival of passions and the consequence of its violence, when we see the irrationality which is associated even with our especially with good intentions and righteous aims, when we see the evil, the vice, and the ruin that has befallen the most flourishing kingdoms which the human spirit ever brought into being, we can only be filled with grief over this transience. And since this downfall is not only the work of nature, but also of human will, it also results in more embitterment. The indignation of the good spirit, if it has a place within us, will be an inevitable result of our reflection. One does not need to exaggerate. A fair and honest summary of the misfortunes that have ruined the noblest of nations and destroyed the virtues of men produces a sense of despair that no positive development can remedy. Subject to this torture, we can only cope by telling ourselves what has happened could not be otherwise. It was decreed by fate. Nothing could have been done to avoid it. After a period of depressed reflection, however, we retreat back into our habitual and agreeable private lives, into the everyday of our immediate goals and interests, into a selfishness that stands on a calm shore and from a safe distance may serenely experience the distant spectacle of storms and shipwrecks. But even when we resign ourselves to see history as a slaughter bench upon which the happiness of peoples, the wisdom of states, and the virtue of individuals have all been sacrificed, a question arises. To what principle, to which entity, to which final purpose have these monstrous sacrifices been made? From here on, return to our original question. We begin by observing how historical events drive us to gloomy emotions and thoughtful reflections. What we will now wish to show is how these accidents constitute the substantial determination of a final absolute result: world history. From the beginning, we dismissed the possibility of ascending from particular incidents to universal principles through moral reflections. The riddles of history do not get resolved when we indulge in sentimentality. In fact, it is characteristic of such approaches to find twisted satisfaction in declaring such questions unanswerable. Thus, we return to our original thesis, but observing that aspect of the tragic picture sketched above contain essential provisions for resolving the question at hand. To begin with, we posit that there is a principle or purpose or destiny to history, spirit. This is, however, and it cannot be stressed enough, only a general abstraction. Principles like laws are concepts, and thus, however true in themselves as convention, are not corporeally real. The same is true of our beliefs, our purposes, and the like. They exist in our mind. They're how we refer to our internal drives, but they do not manifest in the sphere of reality as such. They are a potentiality, something that exists as a possibility or a capacity, but one has not yet actualized itself into existence, come out of its shell. There must, therefore, be a second moment which produces this actuality. This is the activity of man in the widest sense, which achieves movement and realization and manifests as will. It is only through this activity that abstract ideas are actualized into concrete realities, for they are otherwise, by themselves, powerless. Thus, the drives of history's realization are man's needs, instincts, preferences, and passions. It is very important to establish that whoever acts and thereby brings something into existence, they therefore form a part of it and share in its self-realization. If I am active in the self-realization of an object, it somehow becomes my objective. This is the case even when I'm merely going about the satisfaction of my own private interests, and my contribution occurs as a disinterested byproduct of my activity. The infinite right of a subject is to find himself satisfied in his own activity and his labor. If people are to be interested in something, they must see themselves in it and find their own individuality satisfied within its attainments. One must avoid a misunderstanding here. One is still able, whenever they encounter an individual who avowedly seeks only a selfish personal self-advancement, to charge them as interested, and to treat this as a flaw in their character. In condemning this behavior, we highlight how their own private interests diverge from comprehensive general interest, how they take advantage of and even sacrifice the general to advance the private. This is why one who is promoting a certain objective isn't described as interested in general, but interested in that particular objective. Conversational conventions are correct in how they capture this distinction. In any case, nothing happens. Nothing is ever accomplished unless the individual concerned in some way finds their own satisfaction through it. Also, insofar as these individuals have their own particular needs, instincts, and interests, these compromise not just strict necessities, but also include insight and conviction, or at least opinion. If the impulse towards reflection, understanding, and reason has been awakened in them, in these cases, individuals will also demand that, if they are to participate in a general cause, that the cause appeals to them. just that it is justified in terms of goodness, justice, advantage, and usefulness, so that they are able to enter into it. This is especially true in our age. Now that people are less inclined than ever before to see to authority or to blind trust, and want instead to dedicate part of their activity to a cause on grounds of their own understanding, independent conviction, and opinion. We assert, then, that nothing has been accomplished without interest on the part of the actor that brought about its realization. We then move to consider passion, inasmuch as the individual finds an object to which they devote every fiber of their volition, subordinates all other possible interests and claims to it, and concentrates all of their desires and powers upon it. We may affirm, absolutely, that nothing great in the world has ever been accomplished without passion. Two moments, therefore, enter into our analysis. One is the idea, and the other is the tangle of human passions. The idea is the warp, and human passions are the weft of the great tapestry of world history spread out before us. Both find their center and union in the social conventions that enable freedom as embodied by the state. We've already spoken of the idea of freedom as the nature of spirit as the final goal of world history. Passion, from this vantage point, comes to be seen as something that isn't quite right, that is, more or less immoral. Man should not have passions, but passion is also not quite the right word for what I want to express here. What I mean by passion here is the kind of human activity that is born solely out of private interest and of self-seeking designs, such as that some individuals pour the whole energy of their will and their character into narrow attainments, sacrificing all other interests and even all other things to them. In such scenarios, the object in question becomes so over-identified with the individual's particular will that it becomes entirely subsumed and is thus inseparable from it. It becomes the very essence of his volition. It is not humanity in general which succumbs to this over-identification, since humanity in the abstract has no concrete embodiment. It is a peril for particular individuals. The term character expresses this idiosyncrasy of will and intelligence, but the term character is used in a very general way to comprehend all the particularities of an individual, the way they conduct themselves in interpersonal relationships, etc. Thus, it does not capture the sense of purposeful efficacy in activities that I intend here. Therefore, I will insist in referring to passion and hope that by this we understand the particular proclivity of some characters, that the peculiarities of their will are not limited to private interest, but are the driving force that advances general welfare. Passion is therefore the unmediated, completely subjective, most intrinsic and instinctive facet of enthusiasm, will, and activity. It does not even concern itself with querying its own aims. It is indistinct from one's own conviction, one's private insight, and one's individual conscience. The question of essential importance to my conviction is solely whether interest is of a true or real nature. Conversely, if it is so, then it is understood that it is meant to be, that it will attain actual existence, that it will be realized. This explanation of the second essential moment of the purpose of history has an interesting and readily verifiable implication. A state is well constituted and powerful when the private interests of its citizens are aligned with those of the state, when each finds its satisfaction and realization in the other. This proposition is in itself very important. The state must bring together various institutions, purposeful political machinery must be involved, and long intellectual struggles must be waged in order to finally determine what is appropriate. Moreover, these struggles involve private interests and passions, which must be managed and disciplined in order to bring about the desired unification. The epoch during which a state manages to achieve this harmonious condition is the period of its bloom, its virtue, its vigor, and its prosperity. World history, however, does not begin with any such conscious purpose, nor do gatherings of men. The social instinct to band together does have an implicit purpose, to secure life and property. The more this living together comes about, the more comprehensive this purpose becomes. Similarly, world history also begins with a general purpose, the actualization of spirit. Initially, though, this is only a deeply hidden unconscious instinct. The whole purpose of world history is then to render this unconscious impulse into a conscious one through labor. At the very beginning of natural existence, only natural wills present themselves spontaneously. These are what we call the subjective side: physical cravings, instincts, passions, and also later opinions and private interest. This immense mass of wills, interests, and activities are the tools and means through which the world spirit accomplishes its purpose. It realizes this purpose as it comes into consciousness, and this aim is none other than finding itself, coming into itself, and contemplating itself as a concrete reality. One might be skeptical of this idea that manifestations of vitality on the part of individuals and people seeking to satisfy their own petty interests are at the same time the means and instruments of a higher and loftier calling, about which they know nothing. But nonetheless accomplish unconsciously, this framing has been challenged, mocked, and derided as mere fantasy and philosophizing. However, as I have asserted from the very beginning and hope to prove through interest, our belief is that reason governs the world, and thus also governs world history. In relation to this independently universal and substantial existence, everything else is subordinate and subservient, and acts as the means for its development. Furthermore, reason is immanent in historical existence, and accomplishes itself through it. The unified relationship between the general and the particular, between the universal and the individual, between objective truth and subjective opinion, is treated in general form in the logic. But in the course of the world history's development, a course still in progress, the ultimate purpose of history is not yet a distinctive object of desire and interest. While these limited sentiments are still unconscious of the purpose they are fulfilling, the universal is nevertheless implicit in the particular and realizes itself through it. This question also takes the form of the union of freedom and necessity. We regard the course taken by spirit as what is necessary, while we ascribe to freedom what appears to be the conscious will of men as their interest. While these limited sentiments remain unconscious of the purpose they are fulfilling, the universal principle is implicit in them and is realizing itself through them, which on Wikipedia this is labeled the cunning of reason, to look up more about it. And finally, we have a short one here. The Magistrates should be elected by the people, 1789. This is the earliest one. It's also an incomplete fragment, but it's a little interesting because it's Hegel talking about politics specifically. Political institutions cannot remain legitimate merely because they formally exist. Institutions have to correspond to the actual conscious needs and social developments of the people. There is a contradiction between political form and social reality, therefore. The appropriate response to such arrangements is neither preservation, destruction, or destruction, but society should consciously determine what must be negated and what should be preserved. Justice is the only standard suitable for such a judgment. I think it's where you can definitely see how this would transition to Marx, because Marx is saying why this is more or less kind of untenable. Anyways, you not simply negate the existing order wholesale, you determine what aspects of it have become unjust and unsuitable while preserving the still healthy elements of the existing constitution. Again, very similar to Marx, actually, because he's talking about how, social society, it comes from, like, it has the birthmarks of bourgeois society. I think that's kind of a similar concept to what Hegel's saying here. When institutions cease to express developed consciousness and needs of people, reform must consciously overcome the contradiction rather than allowing the old structure to collapse through uncontrolled conflict. Political freedom requires institutions capable of reconciling individual and particular interests with a genuine universal political order. And again, I think that's actually kind of what Marx believes. It's just Hegel thinks that this can be done democratically. He's writing this under a monarchy. So that's why there is actually a very clear line between the thought of Hegel and Marx here. But yeah, really interesting piece. It's very short. I'll get into it now. The Magistrates should be elected by the people, by George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. To the people of Württemberg. The time has come for the people of Württemberg to cease to vacillate between hope and fear, to end their cycle of expectancy and frustrated expectations. This time has not come for those who, whether caught up in the upheaval or deliberately setting out to preserve the old, look out only for themselves and their class and consult only their vanity. They cannot put aside their petty interest in middling pursuits, nor find place in their souls for concern with the general welfare. For men of nobler will and purer zeal, however, the time has come to coalesce their diffuse aspirations in order to challenge the parts of their constitution which are founded on injustice and to pledge their action in pursuit of their amendment. The calm acceptance of the present as an all too vast and omnipotent faith, whether in satisfaction or in despair, has given way to hope and expectation and courage to face the future. The vision of a better, more just era has taken root in the souls of men, and a longing and yearning for a purer, freer state of being has moved their hearts and alienated them from the present reality. The urge to break down the feeble obstacles to this future has them pinning their hopes on every event that offers a glimpse of change, even on criminal actions. From what quarter could the people of Württemberg expect more just help than from the assembly of their estate? The postponement of the fulfillment of these wishes will refine this longing over time, and the distinction between the righteous and the impetus will only become clearer. But time will only intensify the resolve to discover a remedy for what is a true need, and any determinants do nothing but make this longing eat more deeply into men's hearts. For this is not a mere spell of vertigo. You may call it a paroxysm of fever, but it ends only with death, or when the sick matter is all sweated out. It is precisely for the sake of the still healthy elements of our constitution that we seek to expunge the illness. The sentiment that the political edifices as it exists today cannot persist is widespread and deeply felt, and the fear that it will collapse and injure everyone in the process is also universal. With this conviction in our hearts, should this fear become so powerful that we will leave up to chance what shall be overthrown and what shall be preserved, what shall stand and what shall fall, ought we not ourselves choose to abandon what cannot be sustained in dispassionately identifying what makes it unsustainable? Justice is the only standard suitable for such a judgment. The courage to do justice is the only power which can honorably and peacefully replace this unstable edifice and procure a secure one in its stead. How blind are those who choose to believe that these institutions and constitutions and laws, which no longer accord with men's customs, needs, and opinions, from which the spirit of the age has departed, can continue to exist. That forms, which no longer correspond to either intellect or sensibility, can become powerful enough to constitute the bonds of a people. All attempts to restore confidence in the present circumstances and constitutional elements and arrangements, in which no one can no longer has any faith, by grandiloquent fiddling, whitewashing, and grave-digging with fine verbiage, not only bring shame to ingenious instigators, but also pave the way for a much more terrible outbreak, in which the need for reform is allied with vengeance, and the deceived and oppressed masses also suffer from dishonesty. To do nothing when the ground shakes beneath our feet, but wait cheerfully and blindly for the collapse of the older building everywhere, full of cracks, and with its foundations compromised, and let oneself be crushed by the falling timbers, is as contrary to prudence as it is to honor. If a change is to happen, then something has to change. So banal a truth needs to be stated, given the difference between fear which must and courage which will. For whereas those who are driven by fear may well feel and admit that changes is necessary, they nevertheless display weakness. As soon as the start has to be made, they try to hold on to everything they possess. They are like a spendthrift who is in need of limiting their expenses, but who cannot dispense with any article they have hitherto required, and have now been advised to do without, and who refuse to give up anything until they are finally deprived of dispensable and indispensable alike. No people, including the Germans, should indulge in such displays of weakness. In cold conviction that a change is necessary, Their investigations of injustice should proceed fearlessly. For whatever they find unjust, the remedy of it must be demanded by him who suffers injustice, and he who is unjust's possession must voluntarily sacrifice it. This strength to rise above one's own petty interest for the sake of justice is presupposed in the following inquiry. Just as much as the honesty to want it and not merely pretend to want it, all too often, behind the desire and the zeal for the common good, lies the reservation, quote, as far as it goes with our own interests. Such willingness to consent to every reform grows frightened and pale as soon as demands are made of those who express it. Far from this hypocrisy, let each individual in each class look first before they make demands on others and look outside themselves for the cause of the evil, to themselves, to weigh their own rights and circumstances, and if they find themselves in possession of inequitable rights, let them strive to restore the balance in favor of others. The text breaks off here.